Dr. Shaun Ziegenfusz. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
I was actually wanting to start with a slightly mysterious question slash hypothetical, if you'll humor me. And for
Sure.
people who aren't familiar with what we're going to be talking about today, it might seem a little bit strange and it might even be a little bit shocking, but I think it'll be an informative way to open. But I'm aware that there's a chance that if I went into basically any Australian classroom, not any sort of special learning setting, but just any random classroom, that I might be able to find one, two, or three kids in that classroom who have a lifelong disability and they are not aware of it. Their teacher is not aware of it. And maybe even their parents and their doctor, quite possibly, are not aware of it. And this is happening all across the country. But what I wanted to ask you is that true? And if so, what is it?
Well, I would say that you've got some pretty reliable sources there. There is a condition known as Developmental Language Disorder, or DLD, and it is a lifelong neurodevelopmental condition that impacts about 1 in 14 children, or roughly about 440,000 Australians who are under the age of 18. If you actually looked across the lifespan, it's closer to 2 million Australians who have these difficulties with communicating, and the cause for that is unknown. And many, unfortunately, as you said, are undiagnosed and sitting in classrooms or sitting around workplaces thinking that, maybe they're stupid or struggling and finding life a little bit harder than their peers. And that's why I think it's really important that we're talking today about developmental language disorder.
Yeah, fantastic. And is it a bit varied as to what the prevalence estimates are?
So you're about 1 in 14, or, two children in the average classroom. It seems to be relatively consistent. We've got some great research stretching as far back as the 1990s in the US. Bruce Tomlin's work was very seminal, looking at kindergarten age children, found again about that sort of 7% of the population. We know from Courtney Norbury's work in the UK in the mid 2010s, again around that sort of 7.5% of the population. And more recently, Samuel Calder's work here in Australia looked at 10-year-olds and found again about 6.5%. But there is a little bit of variability because DLD is a relatively new term. Up until only 10 years ago, there was more than 40 different terms used, at least in English, to describe children with communication difficulties. And so we had slightly different criteria, slightly different, inclusion in our research. So has been historically, a large variety of potential prevalences in these conditions, but really we're starting to narrow that as we get this uniform or consistent understanding of who these children are, who we're talking about, who we're trying to support, and ultimately also who we're trying to research. So the consensus around this terminology has been incredibly helpful, not just in research, but our clinical practice, but ultimately the advocacy work that we do as well.
Yeah. And so we're getting some agreements on what we should call it and, how much it's out there. But what actually is it? I mean, there's the term developmental language disorder, but what does that actually mean?
So developmental language disorder, if we start with the first part, developmental, it means that it's a condition that starts in childhood. It's not acquired. It doesn't happen because of something occurring to a person. It means that it was very much present from birth and will continue throughout that person's life. Language is a bit of a trickier term because language means so many different things to so many different people. But at its simplest, language is the ability to understand and use information, whether it's through having a chat, learning at school, maybe engaging in a relationship. We use language for lots of different functions. So we want to be thinking about, I guess, and there's potentially a bit of reliance on using language in everyday, and it's a bit of an assumed skill, a bit like walking, talking, walking, they're kind of assumed abilities. So that third part, that last D, is the disorder. Now there's a lot of, I guess, opinions or thoughts on terms like disorder. Personally, not a huge fan of deficit-based language or problem-based language. I like terms like condition or, needs and supports, the things that really highlight who that person might be. But this is the consensus terminology that we have, in English. And it really reflects that there is something significant, and that disorder really puts emphasis on the fact that a person with this condition is going to need some support, whether it's at school, at work, whether it's with a speech pathologist or maybe another health professional like a psychologist. These people very much deserve support. So having that term in there, while some people will have sort of different opinions around it, really emphasizes the significant impact that difficulties with communication can have on somebody's life. So yeah, put simply, difficulties with communication for no known reason. And as we said, it's really prevalent. It affects a lot of kids all around the country, all around the world.
Yeah, absolutely. No. So the next question I had, now that we understand a bit about how prevalent developmental language disorder is and the fact that it can affect kids and adults, I want to hone in on the kids for a little bit. So our school students out there, is developmental language disorder an issue for school students?
Short answer, yes, but I'll back up and explain why. If we think about communication, there's two inputs, reading and listening, and two outputs, speaking and writing. And I'm going to be really cheeky and group written language and oral language together as language, because we need oral language in order to engage in written language. And I think that many people would agree with that. If you think about the way in which we engage in learning and assessment in school, we utilize both listening and reading, as well as writing and speaking, in order to engage in both the learning and assessment process. Now, if you are one of these 1 in 14 children who have difficulties with that language process, it automatically puts you at a disadvantage for learning in school and demonstrating your knowledge through assessment. I think we could probably all agree that that's likely to disrupt the learning process. But what hasn't always been clear is exactly what that looked like. And I think many people would think that perhaps it makes sense that a person with DLD might struggle with reading and writing, the skills that we teach in English, for example. It might come as more of a surprise that it also impacts on mathematics and science and history and geography, because all of those subjects are language based. It's not just disrupting their ability to learn a second language like Japanese or French. It's at its heart really disrupting the learning process. Because if you think about it, mathematics could be divided into numerical mathematics, where we do 2 times 2 and 4 plus 4. But there's non-numerical mathematics where we have, word-based problems where, 2 trains are leaving the station at a certain time and one's making 4 stops and one's making 3 stops and they're, traveling at different, kilometers per hour. To unpack all of that requires some language comprehension skills. So if you've got difficulties with language, you're going to struggle in many areas, not just in English, but also maths, science, etc. So what my research has looked at, and one of my first PhD studies was actually looking at, well, what has been researched around DLD in school, and then how do kids with DLD go? And what we found was quite interesting. One hypothesis we had was that kids with DLD would present with quite a different learning profile to other children. But when we actually matched children with DLD to younger peers, maybe 1 or 2 years younger, we actually found in some areas of the curriculum, like reading and spelling and writing, they actually performed and followed a very similar trajectory to younger age peers. It wasn't totally different. They were delayed in that learning journey, but they were following essentially the same learning journey. That wasn't the same for skills like storytelling. We often call those narrative skills, but at its heart is storytelling. Students with DLD will really struggle to tell a story, often, struggling with the characters and the setting, or following a logical sequence from beginning, middle to end. And if we struggle to do that verbally, then how on earth can we do that in a written format? And as I've already said, it probably comes as no surprise that kids with DLD struggle with their mathematical skills. So when we look at this sort of understanding across a large number of studies, 44 studies, we found that yes, kids with DLD can and do struggle. But what we really wanted to understand was, what are the perspectives of people here in Australia? And then not just what the problems were, but perhaps what some solutions might be. And that took me into sort of the next stage of my PhD research.
Okay, I'm very interested to talk about solutions in a minute, because we're gonna lay the scary groundwork here for a second, where we talk about all the problems, and everyone's gonna want to say, well, what can we actually do about it? And it's good to know that there's answers out there. But let's just dig into those issues a bit more, if that's okay. I mean, that's such a common thing that I think people underestimate what you're talking about how pervasive language is. And they do often think about it as, oh, my kid, is struggling to learn Japanese or French or something like that. But But again, as you're saying, it's everything that people are saying around you and everything that you need to say at a minimum, let alone reading and writing as well. And yes, in maths, even if the teacher is showing you numbers, I mean, they're verbally telling you about the process and how it works and what they are. So if you can't understand that, it's going to be extremely challenging. And I think spoken narrative or storytelling is also one that's very misunderstood because parents that I speak to are often like, "Oh, I'm not really worried about that because kid does, we don't do fairy tales anymore or whatever." And I'm like, "No, no, no. This is like, you know how you ask your kid what happened at school today, or like how was your visit to your mate's place, and they just say, I don't know." Well, that's because they can't, or they find it extremely difficult to formulate the story of what happened in just daily things that they're trying to tell you about. They can't do it. So you can see how that would have a massive, massive impact. Is there things, that's sort of, I guess, what we're looking for in terms of the underlying problems that a person with DLD is going to have in terms of, I guess, their language profile. But is there sort of a way to tell who these kids might be at school that we know about from research or clinical practice besides just doing a language assessment on them? Is there anything that might be a bit of a red flag for
Yeah.
teachers and parents?
There's definitely some difficulties when it comes to identifying language because, of course, these children do communicate. They just don't communicate to the same level as their peers, and that functionally impacts them on a day-to-day basis. So, we can't look at these kids and they don't have a visually obvious difference to them. It's not something we can pick up, and it's not the same as, say, a speech sound error where they might sound like they've got a lisp, or they've got a stutter or something that, really clues us in. And at a population level, we don't really have a great understanding as parents. We've been talking about parents before we jumped on the recording, but many families, they don't know what typical communication milestones are. If I was to put in a plug for some great work is around getting families to understand what does communication look like in the first 5 years of life. There are amazing resources out there. One notably is, of course, Speech Pathology Australia's Communication Milestones resource. I highly recommend it, but I will put out a little disclaimer that I'm one of the authors. So I think it's really good because I'm slightly biased. But I think
Yeah.
that, if we can get population level understanding of communication milestones, then we can actually start to understand what happens when it's not developing as expected. So that's sort of one. When it comes to reasons for referring a child, there's a number of key things we're looking for. Usually we'll see departures in milestones and development in the first 5 years of life, but that's not always clear. And in fact, some children who present with really significant departures from development don't have DLD. It might be a genetic condition or a syndrome, something else that's happening. So it's subtle and it may not be obvious. But once they hit school, if they're struggling with verbally communicating, and even if they are struggling with their speech, that can be a cause for concern and worthy of investigating whether they've got language difficulties. But of course, if they've got behavioral needs, that's the other thing we can be looking for. Any child being referred for behavioral psychiatric difficulties, we've got really strong evidence to suggest that they are frequently co-occurring. So if your, young one is on a behavior support plan, or you're seeing a psychologist for, social emotional well-being support, I would encourage you to investigate language alongside those investigations because, of course, they do so frequently co-occur. What teachers should be alert for is around difficulties with the child comprehending, whether it's verbal information or even their reading comprehension. They might be more used to looking at reading comprehension, so therefore that might trigger, because we know reading comprehension is a combination of taking those pesky letters off the page and combining that with our language in order to have this beautiful, miraculous ability to understand what we've read. You might also see children copying off their peers because they don't actually understand that verbal instruction. So they're sort of looking around for cues because these kids are smart, right? They actually look for people around them to try and work out what is going on. They're going to be kids who struggle with expressive writing tasks with narrative because if they can't verbally do it, you can't write it, And they're just like those kids you said, Lachlan, who will come in off the playground and you'll say, what happened? And they go, I don't know, or I can't remember. They're not going to have those verbal skills in order to explain what was happening. So this isn't all children with DLD, but many of these will be present in children with DLD. And we know that it's very prevalent. So if you've got concerns around, their communication development, you've got concerns about their academic performance, you've got concerns about their behavior, any of those are really good reason to refer to a speech pathologist. But the teachers I speak to actually say they feel scared too, because they don't want to necessarily say to a parent, hey, I've observed this. I feel, like
Mm.
I have to share this sort of negative view and we need to get external support or, support from a speech pathologist. And I just want to normalize that is absolutely understandable. Teachers don't
Mhm.
necessarily have that training and don't necessarily feel confident to refer to health professionals. So there are tools
Yeah.
available. There are screeners, for example, that teachers can use or checklists to help inform some of those decisions. If you're really lucky, you might have a speech pathologist in your school that you can talk to or chat to about it.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. No, I agree. It is a hard conversation to have. And it's especially hard because, for all the reasons you just mentioned, developmental language disorder has that sort of nickname in the speech pathology community and the educational world of being the invisible disability. It's hard, very hard to spot, very hard to know about it unless you know exactly what you're looking for. And from the teachers that I've spoken to and the research that I've read, unfortunately, there's not lots of training out there on DLD. So people don't know what it is, even though, again, every teacher's probably got 2 kids in their class that have got it. So I think that's a very good summary. The behavioral thing really resonates with me because I did used to be a school-based speech pathologist for a number of years in my early career, and most of the referrals we would get would be for the behaviorally disruptive kids in the class or the class clown, the naughty kid, etc. And every time that you assess those kids, they had language or literacy difficulties. Now, of course, there's going to be times where that's not the case. Those things can happen for other reasons. But I mean,
Commonly
the
occurring.
correlation between language problems and behavioral problems and that sort of thing, as you've said, is really, really high. Pam Snow's research shows that the kids in prisons and that sort of thing are like 80, 90+% of them have language or literacy impairments. And of course, they've also got a lot of the biggest, behavioral concerns. Teachers flagging and just saying with parents, hey, look, I don't think that, your son or daughter is able to actually show as much knowledge as they have. I can see that they're bright, but they can't explain it, or I really have to ask it the right way or do it in a certain way to get that knowledge out of them. I think phrasing it like that is a good way to do it, to sort of be like, hey, look, they have more potential than I think we're seeing. Please go and see a speechy. I think that's a good way to tackle.
Couldn't agree more.
Are there particular things that you've found in your research or particular tasks it seems like you've identified that can be hard for students with DLD?
Yeah, it depends on who you ask. So, my research, we've looked at adult perspectives. So, we've talked to nearly 300 teachers, speech pathologists, and parents. And in terms of the challenges they faced, there wasn't always great agreement in terms of what the priorities were, but most agreed that literacy was one of the number one priorities for them. It was one of the areas that they needed the most support, followed, as you'd expect, by language and communication skills. So they were sort of the top 2, but there were other areas that they needed support with, whether it was, motor skills at school, which often does come up, or their social emotional well-being. So there are other areas, but that and sort of those academic behaviors, organizing oneself, responding in a timely manner, all of those sorts of things were areas that they said, these adults said, I think, these are tricky for these kids. We also actually did a study where we interviewed high school students with DLD. Now, it was a small study. I'll preface it by saying we had 11 participants. It took 2 years to recruit 11 people to participate and talk about difficulties at school. So it was quite hard, but I'm really thankful for those 11 young people who I spoke to. And in that particular study, they actually shared similar perspectives, with literacy being one of their biggest priorities, but numeracy was their sort of second priority. And their other priorities, somewhat similar to the adults. But I guess it comes down to your perspective, and there is a little bit of difference. Why I mention this is because it's really common in schools to sit down and do individualized education plan meeting, individualized curriculum planning, whatever acronym your school setting uses. It is very common for people to come together and talk about a child, for example, a student with DLD. And it's important to highlight that in those conversations, it is likely, based on my research, that those perspectives are going to differ ever so slightly. And that is absolutely normal. And that's not to say that one person is right and the other person is wrong. But it really comes down to whoever is leading that meeting to harmonize those views and really take the opportunity to listen. Because teachers and speech pathologists, we found, were probably slightly more aligned, but parents were slightly different again. And then if we don't have the student as a voice in those conversations, who knows what they're thinking. And I really strongly advocate for, even in some of those primary school years, but definitely in high school, including the student in some of those discussions is really insightful, really helpful in terms of determining what they think their support needs are and really seeing them as a valuable partner. I can't emphasize the importance of including those perspectives, but understanding, of course, that harmonizing those to reach a consensus and a plan can sometimes be difficult.
Yeah, definitely. So I think that's really interesting. And I would really love to understand if we can. I understand there might not necessarily be research or clear answers on this potentially, but is there any reason or speculation why the parent perspective will be different to the teacher/speech pathologist kind of perspective? Do we know why that is?
Not absolutely, but I have a hypothesis that I'm happy to share. And I actually sort of posed this, I think, in one of my papers. My thought process around this is that teachers and speech pathologists work at a group level. So a teacher will have a class and they'll have many classes across their career, and they'll be thinking of lots of children. And in this survey, they were asked to think about the children that they've worked with DLD. Similarly with speech pathologists, and I've worked with hundreds and hundreds of children. So I can respond to a survey by thinking about the many, many children that I work with. Whereas parents have a sample size of one, maybe two or three, but most of the participants had one child with DLD. And when you're thinking about your loved one, you're only thinking about that one person. And so they were thinking about, the person that they love most in the world and really looking at it from their perspective. And that will in of itself mean that there is going to be differences of opinion. And I think that that is as true as in the survey as in our work in schools. Because again, I have to sometimes remind myself, as particularly when having a diagnostic discussion with a family, that this is the very first time that they're having this conversation. And I may have had the conversation hundreds of times, but for them, it's still their first. And it's important that as health practitioners, as teachers, that we remember that. It's very easy to become, numb to sort of these really difficult conversations. But I think part of why I love
Yeah.
being a health professional is that we get to keep that empathy. We get to keep that heart in what we do. And really that belongs in the conversation as well. But I would speculate, without having definitive answers, that that's probably why we saw some differences in opinion. Though interestingly, when the data was collected, it was actually during the periods of lockdown in Australia back in 2020 and 2021. At that time, parents were actually spending some of their most educational, most of their time, or some of the more time than usual, in educational exposure with their child. So in some ways, it might actually be that they've got even more understanding than if I'd done a survey outside of that period. And there may have been more discrepancy.
Yeah.
Because they weren't seeing their child so up close and personal, engaging in these academic tasks. So lots of thoughts,
Yeah.
definite answers. But I think, we have to remember in all of our roles that we're going to have those different experiences, but all of them are really valid.
Sure. And that makes a lot of sense. I mean, teachers and clinicians have got bigger sample sizes of what, well functioning and average functioning and below average functioning students look like. So it's easier for them to compare and understand where the child sits relative to their peers. I mean, the things that came to my mind when you mentioned that were, things that we commonly see in the clinic. One is from the parent side is compensatory strategies. Parents are obviously very good naturally without even thinking about it at supporting their kids, and they know them so well. So there's some degree, kind of like how parents, when you got a 2-year-old and the 2-year-old just mumbles some gibberish and the parent's like, oh, they said blah, blah, blah. And everyone else is like, okay, I'll believe you,
Sure.
because they
Yeah.
just know from context. To some degree, the same thing, as the kid gets older. But also parents don't realize that they're doing a lot of really fantastically helpful strategies like repeating questions and adding extra prompts and asking things in more simplified ways and that sort of thing, rephrasing things, etc. And they don't realize that they're doing that a lot of the time. And we often see actually it's only when they come into the clinic for their language assessment and we tell the parents, unfortunately, you can't say anything, you can't help them at all. And they see the kid fully on their own, trying to answer the questions. And often they say afterwards, they're like, wow, I did not realize that they have so much trouble with that. And they didn't realize how much they were stepping in. And again, I don't think that's bad at all. It's probably
No.
fantastically helpful for their kid, but it's just good to keep in mind that maybe they are overestimating how competent their kids' language skills or how good they are with spoken language because of that. And another thing is that academic language, we know, is more complex than everyday conversational language. So the kid might actually be okay at home and on the weekend with friends just talking about normal things in a conversational style. But when they have more complex, more formal language of education, both that they have to use and receive, they might struggle. It's a big jump up. So that might also potentially explain why teachers see it, because it's harder at school, and parents, like you said, they don't often see that.
It can come as a surprise to parents.
Yeah, it often actually is. And even for adults, actually, I mean, a common thing we get is adults presenting to the clinic for like dyslexia assessment, and their assessment comes back that they have developmental language disorder. And of course, they've never heard of that in their entire life. And it's confusing to explain because they will be like, but my reading and writing is so bad. And it's like, yes, but there's a sort of more
Pause.
foundational problem that's feeding into those. But yeah, it can be very surprising for them too.
Yeah,
I was wondering
absolutely.
though, on the other hand of this, your research, I think, has touched on some of the things that seem to be easier at school for kids with developmental language disorder, or perhaps relatively easier. Can you give
Mm.
us a sense of what those things are and whether they're easy, or whether they're just comparably easy but still kind of tricky?
Find this one tricky because some of the areas that adults and students with DLD rated as needing, let's say, needing less support, um, were social emotional well-being, which is really interesting. And I spent a lot of time and continue to spend a lot of time thinking about this because we know from the research that actually high school students, actually all students, with DLD are at increased risk of mental health needs. And they actually rated it as their lowest area. And it's not saying that it wasn't an area that might need support, but it was the lowest area. For me, that was fascinating. Part of it could be that maybe we were focused on asking them about education and school, and maybe social emotional well-being isn't what we consider as a part of academia. But now, as the father of a high school student, and this was done when my children were in primary school, I mean, my children are engaged in so many social emotional well-being programs, particularly targeted for, girls and women. They are engaged so frequently that it still makes me quite surprised that they rated it so much lower when we know from the research that those support needs are there. And I don't want to jump the gun just yet, but when we actually ask them about, the types of supports we can put in place, and social emotional well-being supports were one of them, it was also rated as one of the lower, less helpful types of support. So it wasn't just identified as a lower level of need, it also was identified as a lower level of support. And that really struck me. It was one of those moments during my
Yeah.
studies where I thought, how can that be? So I would say
Yeah. Sometimes, yeah.
it's
Sometimes it
fascinating.
just doesn't make sense. And if you think about it from the language perspective as well, I mean, we know that the language of emotions and the interpersonal dynamics that come with that are some of the most abstract and difficult things to use language for. So it's very interesting. I agree that they rated that low. But
If you were to
you touched on, sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say, if you actually drill though into some of the adolescent responses, they were very pro-social, but if you looked at their needs around peer-to-peer interactions, they rated those as an area of extreme difficulty. So they actually said, this is an area that I find really challenging. I really want friends, but my peer-to-peer relationships are very, very poor. It's an area that they really struggle with. So, sometimes drilling down a little bit can show that maybe there is something there. But yeah, there's much more work to be done on that.
I would be fascinated to see more of the research around that because, a commonly observed trend that I'm interested to learn more about, but that I see clinically is kids talking about the transition to high school socialization. Kids with developmental language disorder talking about high school socialization being suddenly much harder. And of course, going through your teen years is just more complex and there's lots of changes and drama, etc. normally. But also we've got to appreciate the fact that in primary school, as a generalization, a lot of the social interactions you have are doing stuff. You're playing on the playground or chasing each other around. And that, you still do stuff in high school, but it's a big shift to just conversation-based interactions and with multiple people at one time. You've got 3, 4, 5, 6 people standing in a group, all talking simultaneously, maybe not even about the same thing, topic shifting all the time. I mean, if you have trouble comprehending language, that's going to be extremely hard to fit in socially and to do well socially.
Absolutely. And this is what we see adolescents reporting. It's hard to follow these conversations. It's hard to know what's trendy, what's interesting. They don't want to appear babyish or different. So, it's an area that they will continue to report as a difficulty. I had a student report to me once, that it was actually through things like art clubs during playtime or having extracurricular activities that she was able to then develop friendships around a very specific topic interest. So I do recommend to families, if they do have a child with DLD, to, while speech pathology is very important, it's also really nice to be able to engage in some peer-based extracurricular activities. And when I've started drilling into some further information I have around what people think kids with DLD are actually good at, what we are seeing potentially is this theme of either very resilient, which is lovely to see, but also potentially some interest in creative arts or sport, and having some outlets and interests in whether it's art, dance, design, whatever the case may be, or team or individual based sports. These are areas that we can really see them flourish. I had a young woman say, about the art club. She said, if art was as often as English and maths, my teacher would think that I was a genius. But because we have so much emphasis on literacy and numeracy within the curriculum, she felt like she was seen as stupid. But actually, if you looked at her amazing artwork, she was very gifted, but that was kind of hidden behind her difficulties. So finding opportunities for them to showcase their interests and passions is really important, especially for kids with DLD.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we alluded to this earlier. There's things we can do. There's supports we can put in place, which is good news. What are they? What are those supports and what do they look like?
Look, I could have come out and said there's a special magical toolkit that is specific to kids with DLD. And I think that every teacher in the whole country would have looked at me and groaned, because we know that teachers are under significant pressure to deliver a curriculum to very diverse students. And they have already, good awareness of other neurodevelopmental conditions. So I didn't want to come in with something totally new or different. So I looked to the research around other adjustments and accommodations put in place for children with autism and other neurodevelopmental conditions. And what we ended up doing was we presented a range of different options of different types of supports and said, how helpful do you think these are for children with developmental language disorder? And these weren't rocket science. These were giving them extra time. It was perhaps providing one-on-one support. It might be adapting the assessment task sheet so it was easier or, set out in a way that they could follow. So these are adjustments that we put in place for lots of children with neurodevelopmental conditions. So why not those with DLD? And so what we did was we analysed that. But it's really hard to kind of give teachers a list of 77 different things. That's not super helpful. So what we tried to do was find themes within that. And what we found were there was definitely some areas that came out as sort of the most helpful areas that we could focus our energies on. And the first one was additional time. And it came through time and time again, pardon sort of the pun, play on words, but that children with DLD require longer processing time in order to respond in the same way as their peers. This might be giving them additional time for formal exams. It might be giving them extended periods before having check-ins and then submitting their assignments. It might be that they need longer time during lessons, so therefore we need to actually remove parts of tasks in order to give them additional time within the lesson to actually focus in on the essential skills that we're looking for them to demonstrate. Now, the challenge with additional time, though, is that there are only 24 hours in a day, so we have to pinch from somewhere in order for that to happen. And when we try to look at some of those patterns, it wasn't really clear. It really comes down to the school and their context to make some of those decisions. And so I encourage schools and school leaders and those in inclusion support to really think about what works for them. But we also want to talk to the child and see where they need some additional time in order to undertake these tasks. The second area probably comes as no surprise for any speech pathologist listening, and that was providing visual supports. I expand on this in one of my papers to talk about how language is this very ethereal thing. As soon as you say something, it's gone. So if you're providing instructions in a classroom, it's not written down anywhere. It's said once and then it just disappears. Whereas if we can provide a written representation of language, assuming the child can read, picture representation, a gesture, sign, anything that makes that language tangible and concrete that they can refer to and interact with, it makes it more real, and it adds permanency to something that is otherwise fleeting for them. So providing visual supports is going to be variable depending on the age and stage. I wouldn't use the same visual supports in grade 2 as I would in grade 12. So we want to think about what's age appropriate for the child that we're working with, to the point where my high school kids, learning to use your calendar and your diary are great visual supports, making sure that we've got our selves organized using those visual scaffolds, using visual supports when it comes to preparing for assignments or writing a story. All of that can be really, really helpful. The third area, and there were many areas, but I'll just focus on the top 3. The third area that we found as being really beneficial was individualized support. Again, this tends to be very context specific. It may not be that we can have a teacher aide following a kid around all day, every day. That's not often feasible resourcing in schools, but it's also about identifying when are the key points where that child does need support. And is it the support provided by a learning support officer or a teacher aide, or is it that the teacher is released enough so that they can work directly with the child, even for a moment, or, a long moment, ideally, to sort of address what their support needs were. So trying to individualize for the person sitting in front of you, rather than saying, this is what we do for kids with DLD. This is what we do for the child, the person here in my classroom. So there were 3 of the areas we found had rated the most highly for helpfulness. But if you actually look at the student perspective, there was one area that they actually prioritized differently, and that was technology. That was the area that they said they would find the most helpful, but actually they found that the adults in their lives weren't super responsive or super keen to use technology in the way that they would like. And part of that is to do with school-based policies. I mean, we know in a world of AI that school policy does not reflect the current usage of AI, and that schools are grappling with how to deal with this. Certainly universities were grappling with how to deal with this, but it could be an amazing tool, and is an amazing tool for the clients that I work with who have DLD, but we need to use it intentionally. Many, many other technological advancements that we could be using, but we need to think about how to do that intentionally, whether it's speech to text devices, whether it's utilizing visual representation in Microsoft, visualization tools, all those sorts of, organizational apps. There's lots of technology that we could be tapping into. I've had a client just recently suggest that it would be great to use the audio summaries of their classes, but the privacy policy of the school means that they can't record a lesson and have that summarized for them. So, it's something they really want, but our systems and processes don't necessarily reflect their current usage. So I think that's a really interesting point to be exploring in our support moving forward.
Yeah, I agree. And I like the breakdown into those big categories, tech support, visuals, extra time. Something that is genuinely a logistical challenge that I've known teachers to talk about is that those things themselves, as you've just sort of demonstrated, can be fairly loaded. And while there are common things you can do in each of those categories, there's still so much variability. Teachers will be like, okay, the report recommendation for this kid says use visuals to help their learning, but what are the visuals that I can use in maths? Or like, I teach SOS, like what are the visuals I'm supposed to use for that, or in this particular unit or whatever? And, I think there is no one simple answer, which is what's tricky. There's clear themes, but there's not one exact way to do it in each lesson in each grade. So the thing that I usually tell families is like, this is where you do need the speechy. I mean, get in touch with the speechy so they can guide you and your kid around this, or they can talk to the teacher about their specific unit, that specific term, and give them some practical strategies because language is very complex and the classroom and the curriculum are complex. So professional guidance really important in matching up those needs to what you actually practically can do.
Yeah. It does rely on the speech pathologist being at the table. And if we were to take a very national view on this, there's some challenges in that. For example, in Queensland, we've got schools-based speech pathologists. So every school in Queensland has access to a speech pathologist. If you jump to New South Wales, there are no speech pathologists embedded in schools. And we know from work by Jadine Glasby, that there is going to be a difference in perspective whether the speech pathologist is at the table or not. We know that it's really critical to consider whether the speech pathologist is there, and our services let us down. And this is really important within the current movements and changes around thriving kids, pushing supports back to a state and territory level, because for kids with DLD, they're the most vulnerable because they rely on speech pathology as the primary gold standard intervention and support, yet it's an absolute postcode lottery as to where you live, as to whether that speech pathologist is going to be embedded in your school system. So the risk is that it really puts kids with DLD at a disadvantage depending on where you live around the country. So, and at the moment we have 5 partially subsidized sessions through Medicare, and there's an opportunity coming up, and I'm sorry to go on my soapbox, Lachlan, but there's an opportunity coming up in April 2026 for Medicare to actually review this. So we need families speaking out and saying we need more support, particularly in the context of thriving kids. So we need to kind of collectively speak up to get more support services, and so that we can continue to fund people, in clinical services like yours to be able to come in and support these kids, not just in Queensland, but all around the country.
Yeah, absolutely. Families, get out there. Just send a letter to your local member of parliament if you
Absolutely.
need to, and just say, hey, my kid's got DLD and they get no supports at school. Please do something about it in the Medicare reforms. I mean, it is such a big problem, and it's like every area. There's not enough resources. There's not enough money to go around. Even in Queensland, in state schools, the key word probably in what you said is access to a speech pathologist. I mean, yes, but no. The school-based speeches in even metro areas are often split between 3, 4, 5, 10 schools. And the reality is that they're available to service that school and the students. But realistically, the actual amount of time they have means that they can go to that school 2 days a term and assess 4 students each. And those students are going to be the absolute highest priority need kids. So many kids get missed. And then those speeches can't even always deliver intervention or do much for the teachers. They have to just give a report or send a program to the teacher aide, which is better than nothing by all means, but it's nowhere near enough to cover what these kids need in terms of ongoing personalized support. So definitely parents being aware that speeches are out there. Talk to your school, talk to the learning support department, say, hey, can my kid get in touch with the speechy if you're at a state school? And Catholic schools and stuff do this too. Catholic schools will fund their own speech pathologists. Brisbane Catholic Education, for example, has heaps of full-time school-based speeches, so they can access them there too. But yeah, unfortunately, it's far less than it needs to be right now.
I think where we need to move realistically is the idea that, support, tier 1 supports for everybody. And if we can do that really well and teachers can be aware, then they can do some of that work. But ultimately, there are still going to be kids that need one-to-one support. And we don't have those systems in place yet. Yeah, for them to be able to access it. So
Yeah,
a lot of work to do.
absolutely. Absolutely. I was originally going to talk to you about, the adult space here, but I think at this point, that could almost be a whole separate talk.
Potentially.
So we might leave it here for the school student focus and the kid focus. But to finish up, I'm really interested if you've got some information about where can families go, where can teachers go to get more information on this kind of stuff, whether that's online or social groups, and if there's courses and that sort of thing. Can you give us some tips on that?
Yeah, happy to. So, full declaration, I'm the co-CEO of the DLD project. So I think that that's a really great, starting point. The DLD project is a social enterprise, recognized social enterprise or profit for purpose organization in Australia. And so we provide information, resources and training. We have our own podcast, Talking DLD podcast, as well as lots of free downloadable materials for families that have been, they're based on evidence, but also focus on what we see as most important for families. The other thing is that in our website and the work that we do, we celebrate DLD. We don't position it as something that is a bad thing. It's not a sad space to be in. Our children in the work that we do are happy, and you can be a wonderful, fulfilling, family member of society, partner, employee, student, and have DLD. And that's a really important vision for DLD, both in Australia and around the world. So the DLD project certainly has a number of resources available. We've got, for example, the What is Language, What is DLD course. It's free and been accessed by over 2,500 teachers around Australia. That goes for a number of hours, but it's a great sort of sink your teeth into talking about language and a touch point on DLD. My final PhD study was actually a 90-minute webinar looking at knowledge and attitudes around DLD, and that's freely available on the DLD project website as well for teachers. So there's some, really great training, and pieces of information from a teacher perspective. Parents can also access information on our website. We have the DLD Project Foundation, which launched in 2024. We now fund, as of the time of recording, our DLD Together Australia Parent Support Program or Caregiver Support Program. That's a free 7-week program for parents that runs every term of the year, and it's run by a speech pathologist. It doesn't replace individual speech pathology. It complements and focuses on the parent and caregiver's role in supporting their loved one with DLD. So we've run that now both this term and piloted it last year, and we'll continue to roll that out as our number of facilitators grows. And we're also looking at running some high school-based support programs this year as well, running a pilot, hopefully in term 2, term 3. So watch this space. But again, trying to keep these free or low cost is really critical to make sure that we have equitable access for families. In terms of, I guess,
Yeah.
other information, I would just put a plug. I'm not sure when this will be released. But in March of 2026, we will be launching the world first DLD Global Summit. And that will be available online for 12 weeks after it's launched, totally free for parents and people with DLD to register and attend. And we've got an amazing lineup of speakers. Got Paul Orego, who's a speech with DLD, who's in the US. We've got a panel of adults with DLD talking about what they wish they'd known as their younger self and their families had known. A whole heap of authors who've written books around DLD and why representation matters, in books for people with DLD, as well as a huge number of presentations on support strategies at home and school, all for free for families. So if this releases after that, please check it out. I encourage families to look at those opportunities to learn and share and connect. And it's really positioned as saying this is a space where you don't have to explain DLD because everybody at the summit will know what it is. And that's such a hugely powerful thing for families who spend so much of their time explaining and re-explaining what their child's condition is. So there's lots out there. If I was to plug a few other websites, I would also encourage them to check out the adld.org website. That's our international organization for DLD. I'm very proudly one of the international committee members for Rattled. And so I think the resources we have there are really helpful, not just for families, but anybody wanting to explore more about DLD. But definitely there's a growing amount of information on social media, websites, etc. So do search, but know that we're looking for evidence-informed, evidence-based information. Look for some of those references. Try to avoid that. Anybody who's selling you something, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And really try to be that discerning consumer of information because there's a lot out there and it's growing every day. But yeah, have a look, see what you find. And hopefully some of those resources will be advantageous to families, clinicians, and anybody else supporting people with DLD in this space.
Absolutely. That's a fantastic overview. So there's parent training out there. There's summits for people with developmental language disorder and professionals. And as you mentioned, on the DLD project site and the RADLD, the Rattled site, particularly the YouTube channel, I would say people should check those out. Fantastic videos on the YouTube channel for both of those organizations that are really educational and done, unsurprisingly, in very language-friendly ways because they're very visual heavy and contain simple language and they're not too fast and they're not too chaotic. So I agree. Absolutely. People should check those out. Well, Shaun, this has been really, really helpful. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your research and expertise with us. I really
Pleasure.
appreciate it. I'm sure everyone else does. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much for inviting me on.